Welcome back to the Lydia McGrew YouTube channel and podcast. A housekeeping note, first of all, I'm not planning to do a Christmas special or particularly Christmas themed video this year. I've got this other content that's on my mind and on my plate right now that I would like to get out that will be applicable at any time of year. Of course, Christmas is also applicable at any time of year. So I want to wish all of you in my viewer and reader and listener land a very blessed rest of Advent and Merry Christmas. The presentation after this one will probably be released on a Monday or a Tuesday after Christmas so that it doesn't seem to clash quite so much with the season. But as a matter of fact, the gospel is all one, that Jesus came, was incarnate, died, was buried, rose again, and ascended into heaven for us. And it's all of a piece. And so I hope that if you are not a believer at this time, you will really give serious consideration to it, because the evidence is strong that Jesus is who he said he was, God incarnate, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. With that said, I'm going to start talking today about what's called the central section of Luke. I got ahead of myself a little bit and recorded an undesigned coincidence from Jesus' Perean ministry in an earlier video, which I will link in the show notes to this. I have been talking in the last few presentations about harmonization and why harmonization is legitimate as a historical tool. It is not some Christian desperate maneuver. It is in fact a reasonable tool of historical investigation and inquiry to fit sources together and to see where reasonable historical conjecture can even show how they fit together where there might be some appearance of discrepancy. Sometimes undesigned coincidences occur in those places where there appears to be a discrepancy, but other times undesigned coincidences occur where there is no appearance of discrepancy at all. For that reason, I don't regard undesigned coincidences as a subsection of harmonization. I tend to reserve the word harmonization for places where there is at least something that needs to be harmonized, something puzzling about the way that different documents or sources or testimonies fit together. So I want to address such a place in this series, and that is what's known as the central section of Luke. I'll be reading Luke 9:51, which kicks that off here in a minute, and coming back to it. And that continues, I would say, until about the middle of Luke 18. And at about the middle of Luke 18, we kind of pick up again with the other synoptics, and Jesus is entering Jericho, and that's also told in the other synoptics, Matthew and Mark, and that all fits together really quite easily, chronologically speaking, from that point onward. But in between there are a lot of chronological questions. Conservative Christian scholars have very commonly used the concept that I have dubbed achronological narration to explain this, and I think to a large extent that is true. Achronological narration occurs when an author is not trying to change the time when something happened. So it's better not to say that he moves the events, because that can be confusing, but rather is just not meaning to indicate a time. I was just reading the text of a sermon by D.A. Carson, where he was invoking that concept for this central section of Luke, though my terminology is after that. Nobody had introduced the terminology at that point of achronological narrative versus what I've called dyschronological narration, which is when an author would actually be changing a time and making it happen at a time when it didn't really happen. And I've argued that there is no dyschronological narration at all in the Gospels. But this central section of Luke definitely contains quite a bit of achronological narration. But is that all that there is to be said? No. And sometimes when we invoke achronological narration, we kind of leave it there, and we don't say enough in addition to show how things fit together, because there is a puzzle here. And we can see this puzzle if we read Luke 9:51 and then consider what comes after it in Luke. Luke 9:51 says, "And it came about, when the days were approaching for his ascension, that he resolutely set his face to go to Jerusalem." Now that phrase, "for his ascension," is for him to be taken up in the Greek. And it's pretty common among translators to translate that "for his ascension." I think it might be translated as for his being taken up more literally, which then would be related to what he says in John, "If I be lifted up, I will draw all men unto me." In other words, his death. It doesn't matter a whole lot because according to the Gospels and Acts, his ascension took place just 40 days after his resurrection, which took place just a couple of days after his death, so it's all within a pretty short period of time. But as most commentators have said, Luke 9:51 definitely seems to indicate a directedness of Jesus and almost an urgency. It says, "set his face resolutely to go to Jerusalem to die." Well, now, then there's this puzzle, because there's all of this stuff that happens after that. In fact, even at the beginning of Luke 10, if you look at it, it says after that, it's like an explicit time notification, that he sent the 70 out to go to villages and towns where he himself was going to go. And there are later references to his journeying to Jerusalem in Luke, which I'll be dealing with in later videos in this mini-series. And it's like, well, okay, if he's setting his face resolutely to go to Jerusalem, to die, be raised, and ascend, then why does he seem to be moseying along and taking such a long time and even sending out the 70? Even a fairly leisurely walk for people of that time from Galilee, which is where he is at, I think, Luke 9:51, to Jerusalem is, maybe a week. And it could be done in less than that, if desired. I'd say somewhere between 3 days and a week to 10 days, especially if you were, going there, setting your face resolutely. You're not going to go wandering around and doing loop-de-loops in the entire land of Israel and its vicinity. So that is a problem that I don't think achronological narration all by itself is going to solve. That urgent language in 9:51, the reference to sending out the 70 ahead of him, after that in 10:1, and then just the sheer quantity of material narrated after that. Achronological narration will go some distance, but not all the way. So I want to add something to that in this video and then add more in subsequent ones. I would argue, and I think this is pretty definite, I'm pretty strongly convinced of this the more I have thought about it, that the time narrated there in Luke 9:51 when Jesus set his face resolutely to go to Jerusalem, because the time was approaching for him to be received up, should be connected with his journey to the Feast of the Tabernacles in the fall, probably the last autumn of his ministry, in John 7. And I'll explain why and how this is fruitful. And it gives us not just a harmonization, but even an additional undesigned coincidence that I'll get to here that fits these together. So again, as John Wenham says, the harmonistic method is very productive. It's very fruitful in an explanatory sense. All right, so we find in John 7, verse 2, that the Feast of the Jews, the Feast of Tabernacles, or Booths, was at hand. And Jesus has this little conversation with his brothers, who are very snarky. His brothers therefore said to him, "Depart from here and go into Judea, that your disciples also may behold your works which you are doing. For no one does anything in secret when he himself seeks to be known publicly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world." So they're being very snarky, very sarcastic, and verse 5 says his brothers didn't believe in him. In verse 6, Jesus says my time is not yet at hand, but your time is always opportune. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me, because I testify of it that its deeds are evil. Go up to the feast yourselves. I do not go up to this feast, I would say he's saying yet, because my time is not yet fully come. And having said these things to them, he stayed in Galilee. But when his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he himself also went, not publicly, but as it were in secret. And then in the next verses, we find the people at the feast. They know about him, they're talking about him, and they're wondering if he's going to come. And he doesn't begin teaching in the temple and showing himself openly till the middle of the feast, mentioned in verse 14. All right. Now, I think John is narrating quite chronologically from this point onwards as far as the general order of events. He may, in my opinion, make a slight error about when Jesus' feet were anointed and the specific day in Jesus' last week, but he definitely intends to narrate chronologically, and he's talking about the jumping back and forth between the Perean ministry, which is also mentioned in the Matthew and Mark, and these feasts. So, the Feast of Tabernacles, then I think Jesus leaves for a while, goes over the Jordan. Then the Feast of Hanukkah in the winter. Jesus leaves again. I'm not saying the first leaving is narrated in John, but I think it's probably did take place. Jesus leaves, goes across the Jordan again, raising of Lazarus, he goes back again, and so forth, all taking place down in this lower region and across the Jordan during the last 6 months of Jesus' ministry. Why does that especially help to explain Luke? And specifically Luke 9:51. Well, several of Jesus' disciples were from Galilee. Peter, James, John, Nathaniel, and Philip are all explicitly said to have been from Galilee. There were women who were part of his following who were from Galilee, for example, Mary of Magdala, and a group of women who came from Galilee to Jerusalem with him, mentioned in all of the synoptics. So I would say that to Jesus' disciples, his ministry has a kind of a Galilee-centric view. And so when they're thinking of the time, the 6 months before his death, and his leaving Galilee and never returning until after his resurrection to Galilee, they're thinking of that in relation to his death and the fact that he never went back to Galilee. And the synoptics tell us that after this time, he especially began to really emphasize to them that he was going to die. He's going to die. He's going to die. That's mentioned in Matthew and Luke as well as in Mark. So all of them mention it. And so it's on his mind. It's on his disciples' minds. And it's this decisive break with the Galilee region. I think that can explain the statement that the days were approaching for him to be received up. And he sets his face to go to Jerusalem. He goes for the Feast of the Tabernacles, and then he doesn't come back until after his resurrection. I think that can explain that language in Luke 9:51. And the fact that there are 6 more months can explain his sending the 70, into probably Perea, particularly, to go ahead of him into the villages, because he knows he's going to go there. And he can do that after he sets his face to go to Jerusalem. And during the time when the days are approaching for him to be received up. I think that fits together very well. And again, it's not entirely just invoked for harmonizing Luke. It's also evidenced in John and in the other synoptics. But there's more. Think about that conversation that Jesus has with his brothers and how he then waits a little while and then goes a little bit later. Here's where we get to what I believe can be regarded as an undesigned coincidence, also fitting with external incidental confirmation. Josephus tells us that the Samaritans were very unhappy about the number of Jewish pilgrims that passed through their land, which could be thousands, at the great feasts. The Jews and the Samaritans did not get along, and here they were just sort of tramping through their land. There was apparently a road that made this a convenient way to go from Galilee down to Jerusalem, and also this would have brought to the Samaritans' minds the fact that the Jews thought that they were better than the Samaritans because they believed that they were worshiping God in the proper place, namely Jerusalem, where the Samaritans worshipped in Mount Gerizim. The woman at the well mentions this to Jesus in John 4, and this is confirmed in Josephus as well. In fact, sometime after the ministry of Jesus, there was even a pilgrim who was killed, Josephus mentions, because of these tensions. And then that set off a further spiral of events. So the Samaritans are unhappy at this time. Just before Jesus travels to the Feast of Tabernacles, the main influx of pilgrims has been coming through, and then he goes a little bit later, maybe after the main influx of pilgrims has died down. Now let's look at what comes right after Luke 9:51, beginning at verse 52. And he sent messengers on ahead of him, and they went and entered a village of the Samaritans to make arrangements for him, and they did not receive him, because he was journeying with his face toward Jerusalem. So we don't know how many were with Jesus at this time. There may have been some of the 70 even, at least his 12 main disciples and a group of women whom we're told came from Galilee to Jerusalem with him, along with him. So it could be a pretty big party. And they're trying to find probably a house that will allow Jesus to stay there overnight. So his disciples go ahead of him and they say, hey, we're coming through with a group. Can you put up our master overnight? They say, no way. Okay, they just won't receive him. Why? Because his face is set to go to Jerusalem. Now think how this fits with the tensions between Jews and Samaritans, and with the narrative in John 7 where he's coming a little bit later than the other pilgrims. It's just settled back down, and life may be returning to normal, and the Samaritans are looking forward to this when another group, coming a little bit late to the feast, comes through and asks for lodging for their rabbi. That fits with their refusing him lodging, because he's another of these pilgrims going to Jerusalem for the feast. And this is where, of course, James and John say, should we call down fire from heaven? And Jesus rebukes them. I think that fits together very well. And again, I think that's independent evidence that my idea is correct here. So it harmonizes an apparent problem with Luke, with the urgency, the sending out of the 70, and the occurrence of other events after that. But it also has this undesigned coincidence with John 7 that confirms it, that shows how and why people like Wenham and I would say that this is a very fruitful method, the harmonistic method. It's not a desperate, weird, strained, non-historical method that can be explained only by an outworn theory of inspiration, as we read Dale Allison saying last time, but rather it's a method of non-deductive inference that is actually extremely reasonable. Okay, I hope you will like and subscribe and come back next time to the Lydia Magruder channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.